The Provoke Podcast, brought to you by Provoke Media and produced by the international broadcast specialist Marketeers.
Welcome, everybody, to our second Influence 100 podcast, brought to you by Provoke Media and our friends and partners at FGS. For those of you who don't keep track of the initials by which various PR agencies are known, FGS is the culmination of Finsbury, Glover Park, Hering Schupener, Sard-Verbinnen, and basically every big name in the corporate and financial public relations world. And we are delighted to be joined for today's discussion of the stakeholder economy and sustainability and the big issues facing corporate affairs professionals today by Lisa Gibby from Nestle. And we're going to be delving into some of the specific issues that Lisa has been dealing with, some of the broad issues that all of our friends in the corporate affairs business are dealing with right now, and the world of massive geopolitical upheaval, polycrisis, stakeholder engagement, the backlash to stakeholder engagement, sustainability, the backlash to sustainability. We're living in interesting times, which of course is a curse and a blessing. And I'm going to start with you, Lisa, and ask you a little bit about sort of what it's like operating in this environment and how different it is really to sort of what went before.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for having me on this podcast. An honor and just a lot of fun to have this conversation. It's super relevant. Like you said, the polycrisis, geopolitics, I've heard it described as everything, everywhere, all at once. It can be a bit daunting for sure, but I'm definitely and always have been an optimist. And I feel like times like this present opportunities for companies and certainly for corporate affairs professionals to really lean into these times and show value. And for companies that, like Nestle had been around for a while, we're not afraid of these changes. We've seen a lot in our time. We'll pivot, we'll get on with our business. That's just how we do it. And I think as corporate affairs professionals, really our job is to keep the boat kind of steady through these times and to stay focused on the priorities in front of us, because if you kind of lose sight of the priorities, you lose your focus, you're not doing your job. So I think it's a very interesting time indeed.
Yeah, I had a conversation about it a year and a half ago with some senior corporate communications people in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. When I started to talk to people, Alex at FGS was one of them actually, about the fact that public relations people were being asked not how do we spin what we're doing in Russia, but should we stay or should we go? Business decisions. And of course, this has been the holy grail for our profession since I started writing about it all those years ago. We've been talking about the seat at the table and being involved in business decisions. And I said a year and a half ago that I thought it seemed to me, for a lot of the people I was talking to, like they were the dog that caught the car, that they'd suddenly sort of got what they'd said they wanted and then weren't ready for the responsibility of being involved in those big decisions. Or in some cases, we're still not really trusted the way other senior advisors from legal and financial and management consulting are trusted to be involved in business. What has your experience been within Nestle in terms of sort of seizing that opportunity and making sure that the other members of what we used to call the dominant coalition in the boardroom and whatever value what your function brings to the table?
Yeah, I think this has been certainly a challenging period, but one where our function has had the ability to really shine as far as what we can do to partner with the business. And I'm really proud of the fact that I came into the role of heading communications for Nestle globally a few years ago, about 3.5 years ago. But just this time last year, I was able to get a promotion onto the executive board. So I finally have that seat at the table. And I think it's so important to be there. So, you're not just reacting to things or cleaning up or promoting a story, but you're really there advising the business and partnering with the business through some really challenging decisions that need to be made. So I feel like I've seen it both ways. Definitely prefer that seat at the table, but you've got to have the courage to make the most of it too.
And Carolyn, let me bring you into the discussion and ask you what's changed for you in terms of the kind of advice and the kind of help that your clients in Lisa's position are looking for, and how you're helping them sort of make these decisions and contribute to these decisions.
Yes, very gladly. And I really agree with what Lisa said earlier. It made me think of Spider-Man, which I currently read to my 5-year-old there, that the tagline is, "With great power comes great responsibility." And I think this is we're really feeling this right now. I mean, things were a lot simpler only a few years ago. Communication was a lot easier, I feel. I mean, like Lisa also said, right? Everything, everywhere, all at once. I mean, today everyone can like, dislike, share, comment on everything all of the time. And that media cycle that we have learned to know, that isn't the same anymore. It's now, I really feel it's truly 24/7. Before that wasn't the case. Not everything was immediately global, and that has totally changed. And I think leaders, at least from what I'm perceiving, leaders have started to realize that this traditional mantra, the business of business is business, it's no longer really true, at least not all of the time. So there are more and more issues, there are more and more actors also beyond the traditionally defined market, I would say, who are influencing business outcomes, because we just really live in a very diverse stakeholder economy. It's very complex to navigate, and increasingly so. And I think reputation, particularly also the question around ESG in the broader stakeholder environment, ultimately, whether we like it or not, will also impact the share price. And we just shouldn't negate that. So companies and their leaders just need more to succeed, winning support across audiences in this really fast moving and mainly interconnected world. And I think that's become more important than ever. So things like what, how, and when you communicate, and of course to whom, can really mean the difference between success and failure for companies. So, and in that mix belongs anticipating issues, then managing the risks before they break out, being able to move quickly to solve problems. I think these are really critical things that leaders need to keep in the back of their minds.
It's interesting to me. I've been thinking about the stakeholder economy a lot in the context of what's happened in the last 5 or 6 years. And the last 5 or 6 years have been crazy, right? I mean, the word polycrisis has been used already, and that it's a perma polycrisis, right? It's constant and it's multifaceted. And, we had, I would sort of mark as a starting point the Business Roundtable and its restatement of the purpose of a corporation, and then the BlackRock, let's embed ESG into the companies that we invest in, and then the pandemic, and then the Black Lives Matter movement in the US, which became a global DEI phenomenon, then the other 3-letter term ESG sort of becoming first almost universal and then incredibly controversial. And then we had the Ukraine, and more recently We have what's going on in Israel and Gaza. And these are all issues that companies are suddenly expected to have a point of view on. Now, as I was thinking of it from that perspective, Lisa reminded me in an email that this was something that Nestle has been thinking about for 20, 30, 40 years. And so I do think maybe it's worth putting it in the context of it being something that smart companies have been dealing with and incorporating into their thinking for a long time. And it's just that everybody else has been forced, I think, in the last few years to catch up. Is that fair, Lisa?
Yeah, I do think that's the right observation. I think companies are on different timelines. As you mentioned, Nestle has had its fair share of legacy issues, crises, particularly back in the mid 80s and 90s. And we really learned from these. And I would say that around 2006, 2007, we decided to change our strategy as far as how we would engage with stakeholders and how we would really lead moving forward. And that's when we created this idea of creating shared value and setting out a strategy, really with this long-term vision that in order to be successful as a business, you needed to create value.
That was 2011, right? So that was 7 years before the Business Roundtable sort of.
Yeah. It was early days. I would humbly say that we pioneered the idea a bit along with Professors Porter and Kramer at Harvard. We really kind of, I think, kicked the tires on this idea and did some work on it before the term became really popularized by Business Roundtable and World Economic Forum and others. So we've been at this for a while.
But so one thing, though, that does seem to me to be genuinely different now, and again, you're on the front line, so you would know much better than I do whether this is true. But it seems to me that in the past, the criticism came almost exclusively from the left, right? The criticism was you're not doing enough, or you're over-promising and under-delivering, or it's all sort of corporate spin, and on the ground, there's not really anything changing or happening. Suddenly, over the last year and a half, particularly in North America, you've seen pressure coming from the right, where you've seen individual states, for example, pushing back on DEI and ESG as being illegitimate. It's as if, the only person who did this 20 years ago was Milton Friedman, and now suddenly Milton Friedman is a populist character, and there's a whole movement. I hate the term woke, and I would be quite happy not to use it at all in the entirety of this discussion, but this whole movement that has started to equate what I think is just sensible long-term business thinking with some sort of weird liberal ideology. And how has that changed or impacted how you communicate around these issues, Lisa? Because now there's a countervailing pressure on the other side.
Yeah, this kind of gets me back to a bit of our roots as Nestle and being a Swiss company and kind of really embracing the concept of neutrality. We're good at that, and we always try to be super pragmatic. So yes, we listen to stakeholders, from all sides, and the stakeholders have kind of mushroomed with different groups, whether it's our employees or our customers, and it's really coming from everywhere. So I think we've tried to have a really thoughtful, balanced approach to listening to stakeholders and not really kind of going where, like just following the trends. We've got a long-term vision. We try to stick to that. And that's really what guides us in our work.
And I guess part of it is just the difference between believing this is something you got to do to appease some external audience and believing it's what you've got to do because it's good for the business in the long term.
Yeah. And I think that's where I have to give credit to the folks who've been at Nestle for decades, before I came here, where they really embedded for the past 20 years this idea of creating shared values. So it's very much a part of our belief system, our purpose and values. It's part of being a leader at this company. So it's really embedded. So when you have that embedded in your culture, then, you're less inclined to kind of pivot off and take on the next popular thing.
How are you? Sorry, go ahead, Carolyn.
No, and because that triggered a thought when Lisa just meant purpose and values. I think that's exactly hits the nail on the head. First comes passion, then comes purpose, and only then is it followed by action. If you do it the other way around, I think you might get lost in the stakeholder woods.
Yeah. I think we've all seen, and we don't need to necessarily name names on this call, but I think we've all seen companies get it wrong because their commitment was very skin deep, right? That they were just following what they thought was a trend and suddenly found themselves sort of drowning, really, because they had no core purpose to hold on to as they were assailed on all sides. Carolyn, tell me a little bit about what you're seeing now in the governance arena. I mentioned earlier that, BlackRock and other investors had sort of accelerated the move towards the stakeholder economy. I do get the sense that some of them are sort of putting the brakes on now. Do you see that? And how are companies responding?
Yes and no. And it almost doesn't really matter anymore whether the pressure comes from the left or from the right, or whether there is an NGO or another stakeholder group that comes out of the woods. I think just generally what we are seeing is that conflicts in the stakeholder economy, or conflicts generally, primarily manifest in ESG issues. That's just the arena where they come to head. And I think it's especially consumer facing brands that are quite quickly facing, pardon the terminology, a shitstorm. And I think that's just a new normal. I don't think there's any hiding from it anymore. A colleague sent me Victoria's Secret song. I don't know if you guys have come across this. It's a song by a composer. She was on TikTok, or social media personality, not very famous, and she composed this song around body positivity, also I guess an ESG topic. And the songwriter, she wrote it for a girl that she babysits after the girl, I think she's 12-year-old, or was 12-year-old at the time. She was body shamed while happening to shop at Victoria's Secret. And in the lyrics, she describes, I know Victoria's Secret, and girl, you wouldn't believe she's an old man who lives in Ohio making money off girls like me. And in a short time, this song made it from TikTok to the Billboard charts, which then eventually contributed to a marketing shift of this brand. I think this story just shows, or it's one of many examples, I think, that shows that you just can't separate the stakeholder groups, whether they are on the left or on the right, or whether they're called BlackRock or whatever, because everything is interconnected. You need to think 360 degrees and include them all of the time. And I think it goes back to what Lisa was saying. It goes back to, if you have your purpose, the rest will flow from that, but you just can't single out stakeholders anymore.
Right. No, that's a really interesting and valuable point, I think, because I started out framing this as a political issue, which just tells you how much I'm obsessing in a year of elections on that particular focus, right? But at the end of the day, it's a couple of things, and one of them is that it's a consumer issue, and obviously, Lisa, you have as a company and in your specific role to stay right on top of how consumer attitudes are shifting and what is helping them connect with both companies and brands. And so let's talk a little bit about how that's shifted. I mean, I think we've seen this massive embrace of corporate purpose in marketing over the last decade or so. And we've also seen generational shifts in what consumers expect from the businesses that they buy from. How has that impacted how you do your job and how Nestle goes about building its relationships with consumers?
Well, I think of all of the stakeholder groups, and we have many that we're trying to address. We're really driven first and foremost by the consumer, and that's we're a consumer goods company. It's really how do we address their wants, their needs, and we say that we're consumer obsessed at Nestle. So yeah, so that really helps provide some focus for us. And we have seen, and it's also very different by geography. We operate in 188 countries. So you gotta think about the geographic breadth of the business. You gotta think about our 2,000 brands. So there isn't kind of like a one size fits all when it comes to the consumer. But generally we have seen the consumer, they don't always use the same words, but their commitment to sustainability issues, to health and the environment has really grown over time. And, particularly if you look at Gen Z and what they care about, we know that they care about sustainability. They also are conflicted when it comes to what they buy because, they're also, they experience inflation and the price pressures and the tight wallets too. So sometimes there's a bit of a conflict between sustainability and the other drivers of consumer preference around taste and affordability and nutrition. So it's a lot to kind of balance, but I think being really laser focused on the consumer, you just can't go wrong.
Right. Tell me a little bit about some of the purpose-driven stuff that you're doing and how it sort of works its way into, more traditional consumer messaging. The Kit Kat Breaks for Good example was one that we mentioned, and so tell me a little bit about how you make sure that you're sort of appealing to consumers as consumers and also appealing to them as people of conscience or people who care.
Yeah, I think we've seen a real big shift in communications where for kind of early days of ESG movement, it was, oh, let's talk about what we're doing in sustainability or kind of the corporate messaging, but that was very different from the consumer messaging. And we need to bring these things together because ultimately the reason we have a net zero roadmap is we want these things to be appreciated by the consumers. So our Kit Kat brand, which is one of our biggest beloved brands around the world, was really one of the first brands to lean into this with this Breaks for Good campaign, where the chocolate we use for this product is sourced through a really innovative program that we launched in Cote d'Ivoire called the Income Accelerator Program. And the different dimensions of this, I mean, I'm getting a little bit geeky and technical, but this program aims not only to improve the sustainability of the cocoa plantations, but also has social dimensions of helping kids go to school, helping farmer income. So, we tried to bring these messages together, and we now have a campaign that really has unpacked what these messages are so that consumers understand when they buy a Kit Kat bar in Europe that they're supporting a greater good. And we think this is an exciting new direction.
I'm interested again, Carolyn, in how these changes have impacted your business. And my history with some of the founding firms of FGS goes back a long way. And I used to sit down with people who used to say things to me like, we actually do everything but consumer. We do employee communications and we do corporate reputation and we do financial communications and we do public affairs and policy and basically everything but, selling the Kit Kat bar. But now selling Kit Kat bars is an issues rich world, right? And we've all seen corporate crises that stemmed from bad marketing decisions or insensitive advertising campaigns, or just brands that didn't think through the corporate reputation implications of what they were doing in the consumer space. So I'm assuming now that the consumer is as big a part of what you do as any other stakeholder group. And actually, it's difficult to separate consumers from employees, from members of the community, from political activists. It's a much more dynamic, fluid environment.
Yeah, I think we can't think about channels or think of buckets anymore. It's all interconnected. Like I said, it's not just about selling the Kit Kat bars, but it's also about defending the business that sells them and defending the business model there. And I think, again, I mean, like Lisa already explained this a little bit, how this is ingrained at Nestle. And I think more companies need to realize that reputation and the question around ESG in this broader stakeholder environment that you just painted ultimately are interdependent or are affect each other. And just because maybe your consumer hasn't heard about a certain issue yet, what doesn't mean that he or she will not. Or just because your investors haven't heard about this news yet, it doesn't mean that it will not sooner or later get to them. We're all connected via this digital network that we're all using every day, and issues really quickly can create a butterfly effect that will eventually also impact your consumers, your share price. And today that just happens much more quickly than ever before. So I think you need to be upfront about that and not wait until an issue hits you off guard. And that's exactly right, Paul, as you say, we can't just think in terms of disciplines in separate buckets anymore. It's all interconnected, and it's much, much faster, because if you wait until an issue hits you off guard, it's already too late. And this is, I think, why communication, or clear communication, is more important than ever, because it's about winning the support across audiences. It's not just one audience group, one stakeholder group, but it's really across them all. And I see companies getting much more creative there. I think the Kit Kat example that you mentioned is a great one, where there's this upfront thinking already. I read in the FT the other day that companies like LVMH is a good one. They are now going to Hollywood to get their brands on screen. They want to market their brands through movies and television. So it's around thinking around getting creative. How can I reach my audiences? Where can I reach them? And of course, what is the message? And I think focus is even more important than ever. But it always will start with being a good corporate citizen. If that is not in place, then communication can't help. You can't put lipstick on that pig, so to speak. Right. It could even become a hindrance. So, and that brings me back again to that purpose, to the passion and the purpose that need to be at the heart, that good corporate citizenship.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about this over the years in many different contexts, but from my perspective, it's still a lot of it about authenticity, right?
Yes.
Is if you're saying one thing, but it is somehow dissonant with how people perceive you, then that can do, as you say, more harm than good. It's inauthentic and dishonest, and authenticity is one of those strange things, Lisa, that you can't necessarily define it, but you know it when you see it. How do you weave authenticity into what you do as an organization and in the relationships that you build with stakeholders?
Yeah, that's a good,
Yeah, sorry. That's
a tough question. I think it also starts with the culture and leadership and leading by example and being authentic. And I would say there as well, Nestle has been on a journey to show up kind of in a different way, and to be warmer, and to be more human, and to be authentic. And how that impacts, how I can help impact that is by really showcasing the faces, the voices, the people of Nestle, not just the CEO and the executives, but really the people, the 270,000 people around the world working for us, the farmers who supply us, the folks working in the factories. It's really kind of it's shining a spotlight on the different faces and voices. And that helps be more authentic.
You talked earlier about values too, and I assume that there's a lot of work that goes into making sure that certainly internally, everybody understands what those values are and understands what kind of behaviors reinforce them, or what kind of damaging behaviors would undermine them.
That's absolutely correct. And we try to live those values, and we're not always perfect, but we really strive to continuously improve. So I think kind of being authentic and that being transparent, these are all qualities that can help us live our purpose and values. And I want to go back to a bit of what Carolyn was talking about too, with this integrated communications and all of these different audiences. I think the value of strategic communications has never been more important. And having this 360 view of our different stakeholders and how we communicate to these audiences, and making sure that we don't have dissonance in our messaging, that these are all really important things. And having that strategic view of communications versus, just a publicity machine has never been more important.
We've talked about sort of how shareholders have impacted this, and we've talked about how consumers have impacted this. Let's talk a little bit too about the regulatory environment, because that too is becoming more complex and more challenging for companies. There is an apparent divergence between Europe and North America when it comes to expectations, even around simple things like reporting on sustainability and ESG and those kind of initiatives. How important is that, Lisa? And how much does that drive the way you communicate, and how much of it is simply some political manifestation of other forces that you're already responding to?
I would say it's gotten to be much more difficult. And for me, it's been a bit eye-opening as an American that's come to Europe to kind of see how the regulatory environments are so completely different. And you mentioned sustainability reporting. This is something that we're kind of living right now, because this year, with our report that we just put out last week, we had new Swiss regulations. We've gone from voluntary to really having to follow these strict new regulatory guidelines. Coming next year, there's a new European directive. The US is on a slightly different track. Then you have California that has its own laws within the US. I mean, it's just a lot to kind of harmonize. And I think if you're in a position like I am, what you're trying to do is be transparent and show what you're doing. But when you have to kind of chase all of these different regulatory requirements, it sometimes can take away from the work and the impact that you're doing. So our position is we would love a harmonized approach. We would love standards that work globally. We want to communicate globally, but we also recognize that there are differences for different geographies, and sometimes we have to adapt to that.
Yeah. What are you seeing, Carolyn, among your clients in that respect?
Yeah, so I'm based in Switzerland, but also here we really see that there is heightened regulation, and that is something that keeps head of comms busy naturally. I think, I can understand how these increased requirements are, on the face of it, more hindrance than a help. But I also see it maybe as a chance to be even more focused and strategic. Lisa mentioned it already early on in our conversation. I think focus is more important than ever. And again, I think so many reporting requirements that are not harmonized. Yeah, it's a lot of work, but it's also a reminder to really be very crystal clear and precise about your focus and your direction.
Well, while we're talking about sort of the changing reporting requirements and those kinds of issues, Lisa, you'd mentioned in the run up to this conversation some of the changes that you'd made around carbon neutral claims for, again, Kit Kat, I think, was one of the brands. Perrier is another. What drove that specifically?
Well, if you take a step back, we set out in 2020 a net zero roadmap. So how we get to net zero by 2030, and that's always been our constant kind of vision. But as part of that journey, we've tried a lot of different things. And early days, this idea of carbon neutrality and offsetting was quite popular. It was accepted. And I would say over the recent years, there have been many more skeptics and challenges to that model. So, we were never really basing our net zero future on the carbon neutrality and offsetting, but we recognized the change, and we've had a lot of brands who've really pivoted their strategy to carbon removals and insetting and other programs that will reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, but it's not done through offsetting, for example. So I think it's an example of we're in a very dynamic environment. You kind of need to keep your head on a swivel. You need to pivot. You need to read the environment. And then when things change, you really need to work with your brands and your businesses to make sure they understand those changes and adapt their marketing appropriately.
We are running up against the time limit for this, and I know you're both extremely busy and need to get back to your day jobs. So let me just conclude by asking you to sort of look into the future a little bit and think about some of the issues that you expect to be dealing with more over the next couple of years. I look at the kind of list of things that Nestle is dealing with nowadays, and it's everything from nutrition to and healthy eating to packaging to sustainable agriculture to human rights along the supply chain. We've just written a story about Del Monte dealing with a pretty unpleasant situation in Africa, which is inevitable when you're working in developing countries. There's a whole host of these issues. What do you see as potential hot buttons over the next couple of years, Lisa?
Well, I think all of these issues that you mentioned have the potential to be hot buttons for sure. So we're tracking on all of them. But I think when you add to that some of the geopolitical issues that we have to deal with, that can accelerate some of these topics in a way that make them even more complex. And so I actually think it's hard I don't have a crystal ball. I can't see into the future, but I think the future is going to be a lot like today, and that it is just the poly crisis and lots of things happening. And you just need to, as a practitioner in our space, be really resilient and really focus on the things that you want to achieve, because playing defense has never been more important. But if you're not also thinking about offense and what you want to be known for and what you want to be famous for, you're missing a trick, and you're not going to be successful. So for me, it's less about the what's coming. It's more about how you deal with it.
Are there things that you're seeing on your radar screen that we haven't touched on, Carolyn? Or are there things that we have touched on that you think need to be emphasized a little more?
I couldn't agree more with Lisa, to be honest. So I think it's about anticipating the issues and managing the risk, and just be able to move quickly to solve those problems when they are critical. I think one of the things Lisa mentioned, the word tracking, and I think that's something that is going to be increasingly important, insights and measurements, so that you can understand how and also where these digital debates start, particularly as social media has just become more important than ever. And I think insight and measurements, also supported by artificial intelligence, will become more increasingly important. So I think that's something that companies just can't afford not to do.
I was just going to congratulate us on getting through an entire conversation about the future of PR
I apologize.
without mentioning artificial intelligence, which is, another of the various elephants that are now crowding into the room. But yes, that's clearly going to be a big factor going forward in particularly as it develops real predictive ability when it comes to some of these issues. And hopefully it'll make your job a little easier, Lisa.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, as long as we're bringing up buzzwords that didn't make the conversation, the disinformation environment out there is also particularly tricky. And oh, goodness. But it's just another one of these issues that we need to learn how to deal with, and having that strategic communications focus, having partners throughout the business, having good agency partners as well is just super critical in thinking through these issues and making sure that you're preventing the issues from becoming full-blown crises. I mean, that's what we're trying to do here.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much, both of you, Lisa, Carolyn. That was really interesting discussion. I feel like we could have devoted twice as much time to each of the topics we touched on, and then probably found half a dozen more to spend time on as well, because as you say, the environment is more complex and fast moving than it's ever been in the past. The thing that is both terrifying and exciting is that in 5 years, I suspect that we'll be looking back on this as a period of relative calm and simplicity. I don't see the pace of change slowing down at all for any of us, but it does elevate the importance of what we do, what you do as relationship managers, as communicators, as business advisors, to a higher level before. And that's in the long run got to be good, our profession. Very much indeed.
Thank you, Paul.
Jada, thank you.
You've been listening to the Provoke Podcast, brought to you by Provoke Media and produced by the international broadcast specialist Marketeers.